Graham Frederick Young was born on September 7th, 1947, to Fred and Molly Young, who lived in the London suburb of Neasden. Now, Graham was their second child, after daughter Winifred, who had been born 8 years earlier. And shortly before Graham was born, Molly, his mother, was diagnosed with tuberculosis. But tragically, his mother Molly never did recover. Molly Young was dead at the young age of 33. Now, Molly's death was devastating to Fred, who was now saddled with the overwhelming responsibility of raising 2 children by himself, all while balancing a full-time job. So he sent 8-year-old Winifred to live with his mother, while baby Graham was given to Fred's sister, Win, and brother-in-law, Jack. And so in early childhood, Graham was wetting his bed, and he had irregularities in an important lobe of his brain. So yeah, needless to say, things weren't starting out so well for Graham Young. Now, Graham's father, Fred, was a machine setter, and it was there, at Smith's Clocks, that Fred met a new woman. And once Fred was married again, he was ready to bring the family back together, all under one roof. He now would be able to care full-time for Winnie and Graham. As Graham approached his teens, things grew more worrisome as he began exhibiting socially bizarre behaviors. One day, his family found in his possession what appeared to be a voodoo doll, and when his stepmother Molly refused to let him keep a dead mouse that he'd brought home to perform an autopsy on, he then drew a doodle of a grave and a headstone etched with the words, "In hateful memory of Molly Young." And as Graham matured, he became more and more obsessed with medicine and medical stuff. If someone had a cold, Graham would diagnose them, but always using clinical terminology as though he were a little doctor. Beginning in April 1961, Graham had begun visiting the local pharmacy and requesting large quantities of antimony potassium tartrate, which he told the pharmacist he needed for lab experiments. Now, when Molly found out that Graham was hiding poisons in his room, she told Graham's father, and a heated argument with Graham followed. And that's when Graham began storing his substances outside of the home. In the winter of 1961, Graham's stepmother, Molly, began experiencing regular bouts of severe stomach upset, followed by Fred and then Winnie, and then even Graham on one occasion. Their Aunt Win was sympathetic to their troubles, and they all chalked it up to some kind of stubborn bug that was going around. But as summer arrived, the symptoms increased in their severity. Winnie became violently ill that summer while she was at a tube station on her way to meet her fiancé at a movie theater. She was waiting for the train when she seized with debilitating stomach pains. Fred Young was experiencing it too. His episodes would usually begin after finishing a meal, when he would frequently find himself doubled over in stomach pain, sometimes spending entire afternoons on the toilet. But it was Molly Young who would become the sickest of them all. Losing weight continuously throughout the year, Molly's condition grew so bad that she ended up spending 10 days in the hospital. By the end of her hospital stay, Molly had fully recovered. But once she returned home, that recovery would be short-lived. Meanwhile, one morning in November, Molly brought Winnie a cup of tea as Winnie was getting ready for work. Now, Winnie took a sip or two and could hardly believe her tongue, and she spat the next sip right back into the mug. It was one of the foulest things she had ever tasted. She told her stepmother about it, and Molly then broke the mug and tossed it into the trash, assuming that someone in the household may have mixed some personal care product in it and tainted it. But later that day, when Winnie was on the train, she began to feel strange. She lost control of her eyes and became disoriented, bumping into things and people on her way out. With the help of a good Samaritan, Winnie made it back to her workplace, where she then began experiencing something similar to hallucinations. Her employer sent her to the hospital, and she underwent a series of tests. And that's when she learned that she'd been poisoned with belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. And so, this was the first time Winnie suspected her brother Graham of being behind any of the symptoms that she and others in the household were experiencing. The idea of Graham intentionally poisoning anyone was unthinkable. He's 13 years old. Winnie phoned her father after her hospital visit and told him, "It wouldn't surprise me if it was Graham messing about with his experiments." But Fred The father was skeptical because he'd already forbidden Graham from continuing any kind of experiments inside the house. So he just assumed that his son would do as he'd been told. As fall rolled in, something like a revolving door of symptoms plagued the Young household, with everyone getting sick at various points, even Graham himself once or twice. But as the year was drawing to a close, it was Molly who was becoming chronically ill once again. And no one was more attentive to her than her sweet stepson, Graham. A short time later, on the evening of April 21st, 1962, Molly Young died at the young age of 40. Fred had become a widow once again, but competing with the crushing grief were his own worsening symptoms, as Fred too was getting sicker and sicker by the day. So his family made him go back to the doctor, not long after having been discharged from his last visit. And this time, the doctors found something. In Fred's blood, they detected traces of arsenic. And in his urine, they discovered antimony. Arsenic poisoning and antimony poisoning do seem to share a lot of symptoms in common with each other. Both cause abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And both also cause spots to appear on the skin. But see, there are also some subtle differences between the two sets of symptoms, and Graham Young seemed to know about all of them. Suddenly, the family's suspicions about Graham began to darken. No one wanted to believe that 14-year-old Graham might be poisoning people around himself on purpose. But it was reaching to a point where there was simply no other logical conclusion. But it's probably already obvious to you, isn't it? Graham was deliberately poisoning his family members. The following day, a police psychologist showed up at school and met with Graham under the guise that he was with the child guidance unit conducting a careers interview. Graham, so proud and enamored of his own knowledge, took the bait and spoke openly about his broad-ranging knowledge of poisonous substances. Later in the afternoon, 2 detectives showed up at Graham's school and seized the incriminating contents of his science room desk. They followed this by conducting a search at the Young household located at 768 North Circular Road, and even found more incriminating items there. They found 2 small vials of white powder. They asked him what they were, and he told them that one was thallium, while he claimed not to know the contents of the other bottle. Whatever the case, the detectives confronted Graham and asked if he would accompany them back to the station to answer some questions, and Graham readily agreed. Once they arrived and sat down in the interview, Graham changed his mind about the other bottle and volunteered that it contained antimony. "I suppose you would have found out anyway," he said. But then he revealed that he'd kept a cache of poisons hidden in a hut down by Welsh Harp Reservoir, some beneath a hedge and others hidden in his bedroom. Those locations were then searched, and authorities ended up finding, get this, enough poison to kill 300 people. Now, meanwhile, Graham was charged with administering poison to his father, and this is the voice of the poisoner himself. "I have been very interested in poisons, their properties, and effects since I was about 11 years old. I started experimenting at home, putting sometimes 1, sometimes 3 grains on prepared foods, which my stepmother, father, and sister ate because I became sick as well. I know that after eating these prepared foods, my family were all sick. My mother went to our doctor about her sickness. By September of last year, this had become an obsession with me, and I continued giving members of my family small doses of antimony tartrate on prepared foods." For his father, Fred, it was what he'd later describe as the most shattering blow of his life. His message to authorities was to lock Graham up and throw away the key. There was some debate at the trial as to what kind of treatment Graham should receive, and if a place like Broadmoor, a high-security facility for violent criminally inclined psychiatric patients, might be inappropriate for a young man of Graham's high intelligence. But ultimately, the psychiatrist felt that Graham was a dangerous and remorseless offender, and he was sentenced to 15 years at Broadmoor. And after a long period of good behavior from Graham, he was recommended for discharge in 1971. Now 23 years old, Graham Young was a free man again after murdering his stepmother and poisoning basically everyone in his life, which now brings us full circle. Graham had only been at Hadlins for a few weeks when he began poisoning his coworkers. And by 1971, 2 of them had died, another 2 were approaching death's door, and at least 3 others were battling similar sets of symptoms. And a few of these employees remembered that their symptoms had begun shortly after drinking tea or coffee prepared by Graham. So once the administrators at Hadlins dug deeper into Graham's past and found out specifically why he'd been sent away to Broadmoor, and I guess more notably everything I have just explained to you in these episodes, they immediately notified the local police. A plainclothes officer went to the house where Graham was staying and knocked on the door. Now, Graham wasn't in, but his landlords were, and they allowed the policeman in to search Graham's room. When he entered it, he found the walls plastered with pictures from Nazi Germany, images of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, and drawings by Graham depicting people in agony, many with their hair falling out, with bottles around them marked poison. They found a vial containing antimony powder. They found empty paper bags from a chemist. It was learned that Graham was still able to somehow obtain these poisons from chemists. And under Graham's bed, they found a notepad labeled "A Student and Officer's Casebook." Police opened it, and what they found was what you would call a smoking gun. It was a diary in which Graham painstakingly documented the poisonings of each of his coworkers, as well as the trajectories and their declines, down to the finest symptomatic detail. The police began their hunt for Graham, which eventually led them to, shockingly, his father's house, where they found Graham and arrested him in the presence of his father and his Aunt Wynne. After Graham was taken away, Fred Young made the decision to disown his son completely. He went through his house and found every scrap of Graham, from all existing photos of him to his birth certificate, and tore them to pieces. This time, Graham received 4 life sentences and was sent to the high-security Parkhurst prison, where he spent the balance of his life, until 1990, when Graham Young was found dead in his cell at the age of 42, from what was then ruled to have been a heart attack.